Channel. In the winter of 1349, Christians in Germany, France, and Switzerland turn on their Jewish neighbors in a horrific massacre intended to appease an angry God. But violence cannot stop the grim progress of the Black Death. In Avignon, nearly all of the nobles have fled the city. Even the Pope retreats to his country estate, no longer trusting in his protective wall of fire. Only one member of his court stays behind, the renowned physician Guy de Chauliac. But the aging surgeon's final investigation of the disease comes perilously close to home.
Guy de Chauliac continued to make the rounds during the plague in Avignon, to the point where he himself came down with the illness.
And even on his deathbed, he doesn't quite know what it is that we've got. But he's willing to help people. He's willing to try.
De Chauliac's heroic commitment to his patients has brought him to the brink of death. No one knows better than he how slim his chances of recovery are. As the heroic doctor struggles for his life in France, the flagellant movement in Germany starts to fall apart. Originally made up of pious zealots, the flagellants now attract outlaws. They greedily hoard loot stolen from the churches and openly consort with rowdy women.
One gets the sense from some of these stories that in some of these villages, the flagellants were almost treated like rock stars. And that there might be what would be after flagellant parties. The sight of the blood, the stripped down bodies and the sweat and the lean muscular frames and all of that, no doubt aroused many young female peasant hearts. That and the fact that you just had so much emotion loose at that moment in time.
It is simply too much. The authorities finally move against them. In October 1349, Pope Clement VI calls for the flagellants to disperse and is roundly ignored.
The church actually has to look to the political means of stopping the flagellants. The flagellants begin to be arrested, or they begin to be chased away by military officials.
Some masters, now called masters of errors, are even seized and beheaded.
Wir befinden dich für schuldig. Du hast Unglauben verbreitet. Du bist zum Tode verurteilt. Soll Gott deine Seele schützen.
Even with the flagellant movement broken, much of Europe remains violently hostile to the sadly diminished Jewish community. The survivors become refugees, searching for a safe haven.
In most of Europe, France, England, large parts, many German cities, had no Jews by the end of the 14th century. They'd expelled them or killed them. But in some places, Jews were being given greater protection by monarchs and invited to settle. And one of those places is Poland.
In 1349, Poland is ruled by King Casimir the Great.
The legends are that he fell in love with a Jewish woman called Esther. And it was out of love for her that he issued this bull of protection to the Jews of Poland and invited more Jews into Poland.
One of the ironies is it pushed the German Jewish community toward Poland. And 700 years later, that sort of came full circle again with the same group of Germans.
In the winter of 1349, the plague pushes north to the Scandinavian peninsula. By the time it reaches Russia, 2 years later, the crisis is over in France. After wiping out almost half the population of Europe, the plague itself is sputtering to an end.
Infectious diseases have these natural cycles that they go through until that cycle is broken, either by human agency or by, for example, a change in virulence of the infective organism itself.
As the Black Death proceeded and as the humans began to die and society, that it was falling apart basically, it's possible that the human numbers drop down below a certain level and that these outbreaks can't maintain themselves.
The magnitude of the final death toll is so vast that it strains the human imagination.
I think the plague was unprecedented in the scope of its mortality, and I'm of the opinion that the mortality was higher than most scholars are willing to accept. I believe that the average mortality was close to 50%, not a third or 30% as most scholars claim.
Urban centers and religious communities have suffered most. 60% of Venice has been swept away in the epidemic. In Avignon, half the citizens are dead. At the monastery in Montpellier, where Guy de Chaliac received his training, only 7 of the 140 original monks are left. England is reported to have lost fully 2 million souls, a third of its total population. But Edward III, King of England, survives, as do other nobles who've taken shelter in secluded country estates.
There's a somewhat lesser death rate among the upper classes, partly because they could move. They could leave an urban area, they could leave a town, they could go out. Their castles or their manor houses might provide an environment that was a little less conducive to the contagious nature of plague.
Pope Clement VI, who deserts Avignon during the worst outbreak, is also alive and well. More amazing is the recovery of his surgeon, Guy de Chaliac. His journals record his words.
Towards the end of the plague, I developed a fever with a swelling in the groin. I was ill near on 6 weeks. When the swelling had ripened, I treated it with figs and cooked onions mixed with yeast and butter. I escaped by God's grace.
Oh, c'est un miracle, mon ami. Il faut que nous soyons priés.
But for many, survival comes with a terrible cost. Having lost so much, they question whether life is still worth living. Ibn Khaldun, a 14th century Arab historian, fears that evil times are ahead.
The plague swallowed up many of the good things of civilization and wiped them out. The entire world changed.
Think about the impact of losing 15 million people. What that does to society. What that must have done to the church. What that must have done to science, to medicine, to art, to literature. What if you lost a Da Vinci in there? What if you lost a Leonardo? What if you lost a Michelangelo because of the Black Death?
You can look almost anywhere and see the traces of this loss of a third, a half of humanity. Well, I read one tombstone that said he died in the year when scarcely a quarter of humanity was left on Earth. This sense that you're part of a fragment, 25% remaining, that's it.
This is the only time in recorded history that every single person in the known world, without exception, has watched their closest loved ones die in agony. The sorrow and isolation devastate the Italian poet Petrarch.
Consider what we were and what we are. Where are our dear friends now?